A solitary goat stands at the edge of a vast, barren desert. The animal is completely still, and because we use the word this way, we naturally read our modern definition back into the biblical text, into their domain. The holy camp is restored to life. The chaos is returned to the chaos. The destination is set. The wasteland is waiting. But the toxic payload has not yet been loaded onto the animal. Before the goat can be banished into the desert, the contagion of sin must be physically transferred from the nation to the beast. And that transfer requires the high priest to step forward and perform a deeply physical action seen nowhere else in the entire sacrificial system. The sanctuary has been scrubbed. The invisible pollution has been drawn out of the tabernacle, but it has not yet been disposed of. The high priest walks back out into the bright sunlight of the courtyard. He approaches the second goat, the one designated for the wasteland. The crowd of hundreds of thousands watches in absolute stillness. In a normal Israelite sacrifice throughout the rest of the year, the ritual of transfer was simple. If a person brought a lamb or a bull for a standard offering, the text instructed them to place a single hand on the animal's head before it was killed. It was a brief gesture of identification. It essentially meant, "This animal represents me." But on the Day of Atonement, the instructions for the living goat are explicitly different. We assume the ancient scapegoat was simply another traditional sacrifice, an innocent animal violently killed on an altar to pay a legal penalty for human sin. Leviticus chapter 16 commands Aaron to lay both his hands on the head of the live goat. The ancient Hebrew verb used here implies much more than a gentle touch. It means to press down firmly, to lean into, to rest one's physical mass upon something. The high priest does not just hover his palms over the animal. He leans forward. He places his full body weight onto the skull of the goat. You can imagine the animal shifting its hooves in the dirt, bracing its legs, trembling under the sudden, heavy pressure of a grown man driving it downward. And as he leans his weight onto the animal, the high priest begins to speak. He confesses over the goat all the iniquities of the Israelites, and all their transgressions, all their sins. This is a crucial detail. The daily sacrifices throughout the year were primarily designed to cover unintentional sins mistakes, ritual accidents, failures of ignorance. But the word used here for transgressions is the Hebrew word pesha. It means willful, calculated rebellion. It refers to the high-handed, intentional evils of the community, the planned thefts, the quiet extortions, the deliberate betrayals, the hidden violence, the secret abuses. As the high priest speaks, the abstract concept of guilt becomes intensely physical. The heavy, trembling hands of Aaron represent the crushing psychological, but the ancient text creates a problem. If you open the scroll of Leviticus and read the original instructions, a jarring contradiction emerges, and spiritual weight of an entire nation's darkest secrets. The pollution that was previously airborne and clinging to the sanctuary is now being concentrated, funneled down through the arms of the priest, and packed tightly into the physical body of a single, living creature. Up to this point, the question of the ritual has been architectural. The space needed to be cleaned, but in this exact moment, the ritual escalates. The goat becomes a vessel. It absorbs the toxic payload of human failure. The transfer is complete. The heavy burden of guilt has finally been lifted off the shoulders of the people. But this creates an immediate, desperate problem. The sin has been transferred to the goat. But the goat is still standing in the courtyard. The contagion is no longer on the altar, but it is still inside the camp. As long as this sign-soaked animal remains within the borders of the community, the entire nation remains in extreme danger. The bomb has been armed, and now it must be carefully, urgently carried away. But how do you ensure that a living, wandering animal, carrying the curse of a nation, never wanders back? To guarantee the camp's survival, the community had to ensure absolute finality. And as the centuries passed, the ancient Israelites developed a terrifying way to make sure the goat never returned. The ritual does not use one goat. It requires two. They must be practically identical, matching in size, appearance, and value. The high priest steps back. He removes his hands from the animal's head, lifting his physical weight. But the spiritual weight of the nation's rebellion remains pressed into the goat. The animal is now a concentrated vessel of toxic guilt. It cannot remain in the courtyard for another minute. An appointed man, chosen specifically for this hazardous duty, steps forward and takes the tether. He turns the goat and begins to walk. As he moves through the camp, the crowd of hundreds of thousands parts before him in absolute silence. No one wants to touch the animal. No one wants to accidentally brush against the concentrated contagion of Israel's sin. The man leads the goat past the bronze altar, out of the tabernacle gates, past the endless rows of temporary shelters, and finally crosses the outermost boundary of the encampment. They leave the oasis of the divine presence and step out into the blinding heat of the Judean wilderness. The original instructions in Leviticus were simple. The man was to lead the goat into a solitary land and release it into the wild. But imagine the psychological terror of that original system. You are an Israelite, your deepest, most shameful failures have been placed on this animal and sent away. A week passes. You are gathering wood at the edge of the camp. You look out at the horizon. They are brought to the entrance of the sanctuary, where the high priest casts lots over them to determine their differing fates. And you see a goat wandering back toward the tents. The contagion is returning. Your guilt is coming home. As the centuries passed, the ancient Israelites became paralyzed by this fear. By the time of the Second Temple, the era just before the arrival of Jesus, the religious leaders recognized that simply releasing the goat was too risky. If it returned, the sin returned. To protect the conscience of the nation, they altered the ritual to ensure absolute finality. Ancient Jewish texts like the Mishnah record these terrifying historical adjustments. First, the priests began tying a bright crimson cord around the horns of the scapegoat. Another piece of the same scarlet thread was tied to the doors of the sanctuary. Tradition held that when the goat reached its final destination and the sacrifice was accepted by God, the thread at the temple would miraculously turn white, a physical manifestation of the prophet Isaiah's words, "Though your sins are like scarlet, they shall be as white as snow." But the most drastic change was the destination itself. The appointed man no longer just walked into the desert and dropped the rope. Instead, a relay system of elevated booths was built, extending miles out into the wasteland. Priests stood in these towers, watching the man's progress, signaling to one another with flags. The man walked until he reached a specific, jagged cliff. The first goat is killed. Its blood is carefully collected and carried into the deepest, darkest room of the tabernacle to cleanse the sacred space. With a sheer drop, a place called Zook, he did not let the animal go. Instead, he divided the crimson cord, tied half of it to a rock, and tied the other half to the goat's horns. Then, to guarantee that the vessel of Israel's sin could never wander back into the holy camp, he pushed the animal backward over the precipice. Israel had become so desperate for finality, so terrified of their forgiven sins returning to them, that they engineered a fatal end to the ritual. The physical destruction of the animal provided the absolute psychological closure the nation demanded. The guilt was gone. It had been returned to the chaos. This ancient mechanism successfully cleared the conscience of a nation, but it had to be repeated every single year. The relief was only temporary. The writer of Hebrews tells us that the entire architecture of Yom Kippur was merely a shadow of a larger, permanent pattern. Centuries later, during a Passover season, a different appointed man is handed over to Roman soldiers. He is loaded with a different weight, and he is led on a long walk outside the walls of Jerusalem. A Friday morning in the spring. The scene is chaotic, filled with the screaming of a hostile crowd, a sharp contrast to the absolute silence of the ancient tabernacle courtyard. A man is bleeding, carrying the heavy, rough timber of a Roman cross. But the second goat, the one actually designated as the scapegoat, is explicitly not killed. In fact, Leviticus 16 commands that it must be kept alive. He is led through the narrow streets by armed soldiers. He passes the temple, walks past the crowds, and finally steps through the stone gates, leaving the holy city behind. He is marched out to a rocky elevation called Golgotha, a place of death and execution. To a Roman soldier, this is simply another political insurgent being eliminated. But to a first-century Jewish mind, deeply trained in the architecture of Leviticus, a profound cosmic pattern is violently repeating itself. The author of the book of Hebrews saw this connection and made it explicit. The writer points out that in the ancient sacrificial system, the blood of the animal was brought into the holy places by the high priest, but the body that carried the contamination had to be removed from the community. Hebrews chapter 13 states, "And so Jesus also suffered outside the city gate to make the people holy through his own blood." The geography of the crucifixion is not a historical accident. It is a theological requirement. For centuries, the Israelites needed two perfectly identical goats because no single physical animal could survive. Both halves of the atonement. One had to die to provide the cleansing blood. The other had to live to physically carry the pollution into the wasteland. The ancient ritual was fractured into two parts because normal biological life is limited. It is never placed on the bronze altar. Its blood is never shed. Instead, after the high priest presses his heavy hands onto the animal's head. But on the cross, Jesus collapses both halves of the Yom Kippur ritual into a single, permanent historical reality. He is the ultimate fulfillment of the goat designated for Yahweh. His life is poured out. And the gospel writers tell us that at the exact moment he stops breathing, the massive, heavy curtain inside the temple, the veil protecting the Holy of Holies, is violently torn from top to bottom. The cosmic architecture is completely and permanently cleansed. The sacred space is thrown wide open to humanity. But Jesus is simultaneously the fulfillment of the goat designated for Azazel. He is not killed on the polished bronze altar in the center of the camp. He is marched out into the dust and the heat of the wasteland. Instead of a high priest leaning on his head, the entire crushing weight of human rebellion, every intentional cruelty, every hidden theft, every high-handed act of betrayal is pressed heavily into him. He acts as the final vessel. He absorbs the toxic contagion of human evil. And then, he carries that curse outside the camp. He takes it into the ultimate realm of chaos and death, absorbing the destruction into himself so that it can never wander back into the community. He does what the ancient Israelites always wanted to do, but couldn't completely achieve. He ensures absolute, eternal finality. The scarlet cord of human rebellion is finally and permanently turned white, and confesses all the intentional, high-handed rebellions of the nation. The goat is handed over to a specially appointed man. The ancient deep clean is finished forever. Understanding this brilliant theological architecture changes how we read the New Testament. But it also forces a difficult confrontation with how we live right now. We no longer cast lots over animals in a dusty courtyard, but the deeply rooted psychological need for a scapegoat has not disappeared from the human heart. It has simply evolved. We like to think we have outgrown the ancient, primitive rituals of Leviticus. We no longer gather in dusty courtyards to watch animals banished into the desert. But the truth is, we practice the scapegoat ritual every single day. The architecture of the camp has changed, but the psychology of human shame has not. When you feel the heavy, suffocating weight of your own failures when your inadequacies are exposed, when your anxiety spikes, when your own internal pollution threatens to overwhelm you, what is your immediate instinct? The human reflex is never to sit quietly with the guilt. The reflex is to find a vessel. We desperately look for somewhere else to place the weight. We do not use goats anymore. We use people. Watch how our modern social camps operate. In our families, our workplaces, and our digital public squares. We are obsessed with finding someone to carry the collective blame. When a marriage fractures, one partner often constructs a narrative that places the entirety of the failure onto the other. Instead of a knife, the animal is given a tether. It is led away. It walks out of the tabernacle courtyard, pressing the heavy hands of blame onto their head so they can survive the psychological fallout. When a community faces a crisis, we immediately search for an outsider, a rival, or a dissenting voice to absorb our collective anxiety. We load them up with our own toxicity, declare them the source of the contagion, and systematically push them outside the boundaries of our camp. We cancel them. We exile them. We drive them over the edge of a social cliff, believing that their destruction will finally restore the purity of our space. We assume that if we can just remove the offending person from our presence, our collective conscience will be clean. But here is the terrifying reality of human scapegoating. It never actually works. When you cast a human being out of your camp to pay for your own internal shame, you might feel a temporary rush of relief. The immediate tension dissipates. You feel justified, but the contagion is still inside you. The invisible pollution has not actually been removed. It has only been masked by the adrenaline of self-righteousness. And because the guilt is still there, the relief quickly fades. The toxicity builds up again in the quiet moments of the night. And soon, you will need to find another victim. Human scapegoating demands an endless supply of sacrifices because a flawed human vessel can never truly absorb the sin of another. Behind it, the noise of an entire nation. Hundreds of thousands of people gathered around a sprawling encampment has fallen perfectly silent, past the silent, watching crowds of Israel, out past the boundaries of the camp, and disappears into the lethal, uninhabitable wasteland. A broken person cannot carry your pollution into the chaos. They are just as contaminated as you are. This brings the ancient theology into your present reality. What is the pressure in your life revealing right now? Whose head are you trying to press your hands onto? What mistakes are you desperately trying to force someone else to carry into the wasteland so that your own camp can feel clean? If you are trying to manage your own guilt by finding a human scapegoat, you are participating in a broken ritual that will ultimately destroy both you and the people around you. You cannot cleanse your own conscience by pushing someone else over the precipice. If human scapegoating fails to remove the contamination, how do we actually experience the profound relief of the wilderness exile? How do we stop the endless cycle of finding new victims to bear our shame? The answer requires returning to the heavy, trembling hands of the high priest. Step back and look at the vast architecture of what God has done. For centuries, humanity has instinctively understood the terrifying reality of its own pollution. The ancient Israelites saw it as a physical contagion clinging to the golden furniture of the sanctuary, threatening their very survival. They knew it had to be scrubbed with blood and then carried away into the dark chaos of the desert. The most famous symbol of substitutionary death in our vocabulary actually survived the ritual, which forces us to ask a much deeper question. Today, we still feel the exact same toxicity. We feel the heavy, accumulating weight of our intentional rebellions, our quiet betrayals, and our hidden abuses. But instead of an ancient ritual, we frantically search for other people to carry our blame, exiling them to try and survive the fallout of our own failures. We are all standing at the boundaries of our own camps, terrified that our past is going to wander back and destroy us. But the message of the biblical scapegoat is that you no longer have to find a victim to carry your shame, and you no longer have to live in fear that your forgiven sins are going to return to condemn you. Return to that opening image. Imagine standing in the blinding heat of that ancient courtyard. The silence of 1 million people is deafening. But this time, you are not watching a high priest press his hands onto the head of a frightened animal. You are feeling the reality of what the cross has actually accomplished. Think of the crushing psychological and spiritual weight you have been carrying. The things you have done that you hope no one ever discovers. The deep, high-handed guilt you cannot seem to shake. The secret shame that makes you feel fundamentally contaminated and unworthy of the divine presence. Now, imagine taking that heavy, suffocating weight. If the scapegoat is not killed to pay the legal penalty for sin, then what exactly is it doing? And pressing your hands down onto the shoulders of the appointed man outside the walls of Jerusalem. He does not reject you. He does not collapse under the pressure of your guilt. He willingly absorbs the toxic payload of your life. He becomes the final vessel. And this is where the ancient symbol is transformed. The weight does not stay on your hands. As Christ takes the burden, you feel the physical sensation of the pressure lifting. For the first time in your life, your shoulders are light. You are no longer holding the crushing mass of your own failure. You step back. You stand at the edge of the wilderness, and you watch him walk away. He carries your shame past the boundaries of your community. He carries it out into the dark wasteland of death. He takes the absolute worst things about you, the intentional rebellions, the calculated pride, the hidden sins, and he absorbs them into the chaos, so they can never return to haunt you. He takes them over the precipice, ensuring absolute finality. Your darkest, most intentional failures have not just been legally pardoned in a sterile, invisible courtroom. They have been permanently exiled. They have been banished over the horizon of God's memory. The contagion is gone. The camp is clean. The heavy hands of your past have been lifted. Why did the ultimate cleansing of Israel require sending a living animal into the realm of chaos? You do not have to live in fear of the wasteland anymore. The scapegoat has already vanished into the desert, and he is never bringing your shame back. If this study helped you see the overwhelming grace of Scripture in a new way, please subscribe and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below with what surprised you the most. And if the sin was not destroyed by a knife on the altar, where exactly is the contagion going? This is not ultimately a story about an innocent animal taking our punishment. It is a story about the absolute, irreversible removal of our darkest shame. To understand why the animal had to live, and why it had to be banished into the desert, we have to strip away our modern, clinical view of wrongdoing. We have to enter the ancient world. We have to understand how the people of the Bible viewed the terrifying, physical reality of human evil. Modern people tend to think of sin as a broken rule, a legal demerit recorded in a heavenly ledger. If you break a law, you receive a penalty. Beside the animal stands the high priest, his linen garments already stained with the blood of previous sacrifices. We view forgiveness as a judge striking an invisible record from an invisible book. It is a sterile, administrative transaction, but the ancient Israelites did not share this abstract, courtroom view of reality. For them, the stakes were not merely legal, they were profoundly physical. The problem was not just that a law was broken, the problem was that a space was contaminated. Imagine standing in the center of the ancient Israelite encampment. Surrounding you are hundreds of thousands of temporary shelters, stretching out toward the horizon. But in the exact center sits a structure of wood, bronze, dyed linen, and gold, the tabernacle. This was not merely a large tent for religious gatherings. It was the physical intersection of heaven and earth. The blazing, terrifying presence of the Creator hovered over it, visible as a pillar of smoke by day and fire by night. The camp was an oasis of life in the middle of a desert of death. But there was a terrifying vulnerability to this divine architecture. The pure holiness of God cannot safely coexist with the dark corruption of human rebellion. When an Israelite committed a wrong, it was not just a bad decision that faded into the past. It generated a toxic residue. The biblical writers understood moral failure, violence, and idolatry as a kind of spiritual contagion. It was an active, airborne pollution. He steps forward, raises his arms, and places both of his hands heavily onto the head of the goat. It did not merely hover over the individual who committed the act. It magnetically attracted itself to the center of the camp. Every unconfessed theft, every act of exploitation, every hidden betrayal acted like a slow leak of radiation. The invisible sludge clung to the bronze altar. It coated the woven curtains. It accumulated on the golden furniture inside the most sacred rooms of the tabernacle. If this invisible pollution was allowed to build up, the camp would inevitably reach a critical mass of toxicity. The holy presence of God, unable to dwell in a house saturated with human evil, would be forced to evacuate the sanctuary. If the presence of God departed, the nation would be left completely defenseless against the harsh elements and hostile empires surrounding them. This is why daily sacrifices were necessary. They provided regular maintenance. But those daily rituals only managed the minor, unintentional offenses. The deep, intentional, high-handed rebellions, the sins committed with a raised fist remained. They were steadily staining the architecture of the camp. This brings us back to the silence of Yom Kippur. The Day of Atonement was not just a national day of quiet reflection. It was an emergency hazard team, deep clean of the cosmic architecture. The blood of the first goat, the one killed at the altar, acted as a powerful, divine solvent. The high priest carried that blood into the Holy of Holies to scrub the accumulated pollution off the sacred furniture. He leans forward, pressing his physical weight into the animal, his voice trembling as he begins to speak into the silence. But anyone who has ever cleaned a house knows a basic law of physics. Scrubbing a floor only moves the dirt into the bucket. The dirt is no longer on the floor, but it is still in the house. The blood of the first goat wiped the sanctuary clean, but the toxic payload itself still existed. It had been gathered up, concentrated into a single, lethal mass of guilt. Now, it had to be physically removed from the camp, and that disposal required a lottery. The scene in the tabernacle courtyard is tense, thick with the smell of burning incense and wood smoke. 2 goats are brought before the high priest. According to ancient Jewish traditions recorded in the Mishnah, these 2 animals had to be entirely indistinguishable. They were to be identical in height, in appearance, and in value. They were purchased at the exact same time, from the exact same national treasury. The high priest stands between them. He reaches into a receptacle and draws out 2 small inscribed objects, the lots. Leviticus chapter 16 describes this precise moment. Aaron shall cast lots over the 2 goats, 1 lot for the Lord and the other lot for Azazel. This small mechanical detail, the casting of lots, is easy to read past, but it carries immense theological weight. Why rely on a random draw? This is the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. And this specific moment is the origin of one of the most famous concepts in the English language, the scapegoat. Why doesn't the high priest simply inspect the animals and choose the finest one for the altar and the weakest one for the desert? Because human judgment has no place in the deep cleaning of the cosmic architecture. If the high priest chose, it would imply that one goat was inherently more worthy of the divine presence, or that the other was naturally more deserving of exile. But they are perfectly equal. Neither animal possesses a flaw. Neither has earned its fate. The lottery removes all human preference, placing the terrifying mechanics of life and death entirely under the sovereignty of God. The high priest opens his hands. The lot in his right hand falls upon the goat on his right. The lot in his left hand falls upon the goat on his left. One object bears the inscription, for Yahweh. The other bears the inscription, for Azazel. The fate of both animals is sealed in a single heartbeat. The goat designated for Yahweh is immediately led away to be sacrificed. It will not survive the afternoon. Its blood will become the divine solvent, carried behind the thick veil to scrub the invisible, accumulated pollution off the golden mercy seat. It surrenders its life to restore the sacred space. But the goat on which the second lot falls, the one that will bear the physical contagion. In modern culture, we all know what a scapegoat is. It is the person in the office of the nation's guilt is kept alive. It stands tethered and waiting in the dust of the courtyard while the sanctuary is purged. It is destined for the wasteland. But if you read that passage in a standard English translation, you will likely not see the word Azazel. Instead, your Bible will probably say the lot fell for the scapegoat. This was a translation choice made in the 1500s by a pioneering English scholar named William Tyndale. He created a compound word, scapegoat, to describe the animal that gets away. It was a brilliant piece of English vocabulary, and it permanently shaped our language. But it accidentally obscured a dark and disturbing detail in the original Hebrew text. In the original language, the lot does not say for the scapegoat. It says the animal is being sent to Azazel. The grammar is perfectly balanced. The goat belonging to Yahweh is given to Yahweh. Therefore, the goat belonging to Azazel is being sent to Azazel. But who? Or what? Is that? For centuries, translators, rabbis, and theologians have struggled with this single, mysterious Hebrew word. It appears nowhere else in the entire Hebrew Bible. Yet, tracing its ancient meaning opens a terrifying door into ancient cosmology. The living goat stands tethered in the courtyard. The destination has been named, but the English translation, scapegoat, obscures the terrifying reality, the family, or the political system who is forced to take the blame for everyone else's failures, of where this animal is actually going. The Hebrew term at the center of the mystery is Azazel, because the word appears nowhere else. In the Hebrew Bible, ancient rabbis and modern linguists have debated its exact meaning for thousands of years. Historically, there have been three primary ways to understand it. First, some ancient commentators believed it referred to a geographic location. They argued that Azazel meant a rough and rugged place, specifically a jagged cliff in the Judean wilderness where the goat would eventually be taken. Second, others argued it was a compound word. They broke the Hebrew down into Ez, meaning goat, and Azel, meaning to go away. This was the interpretation that William Tyndale relied upon in Man. In the 16th century, when he invented the English word scapegoat, the translation is accurate in describing what the animal does, but it misses a critical nuance in the original grammar. The third view recognizes a much darker pattern in the text. The structure of the sentence in Leviticus creates a direct, balanced parallel. The high priest casts two lots. One is for Yahweh, and the other is for Azazel. Yahweh is a one, proper name, a distinct personal being. The grammar strongly suggests that Azazel is also a proper name. It is not just a place, and it is not just a description of the animal. It is an entity. To the ancient Israelite mind, the wilderness was not simply a scapegoat is the innocent victim who is crushed, punished, or destroyed so that the guilty can survive. Dry geographic region. It was the realm of chaos, death, and anti-creation. During the centuries between the Old and New Testaments, ancient Jewish literature expanded heavily on this concept. In highly influential texts like the Book of Enoch, Azazel is explicitly named as a leader of the fallen. Angels, a demonic architect who taught humanity how to craft weapons, commit violence, and corrupt the earth. In Jewish tradition, Azazel was a spirit of rebellion bound in the deep desert. But this interpretation creates an immediate, severe theological objection. Is the book of Leviticus commanding the Israelites to offer a sacrifice to a desert demon? Absolutely not. And this is exactly why the second goat cannot be killed. In the biblical system, a sacrifice requires an altar, the shedding of blood, and the offering of the animal's life to God. The goat for Yahweh experiences all of this. But the goat for Azazel is explicitly kept alive. You do not offer a living, wandering animal to a deity as a sacrifice. The ritual is not an act of worship toward a demon. It is a cosmic eviction notice. God is taking the toxic pollution of human violence, betrayal, and idolatry, stripping it out of his holy camp, and sending it back to the wasteland where it belongs. It is a divine return to sender. The evil that the forces of chaos introduced into the human community is being loaded up and marched right back